It is officially championship week in the 2024 fantasy football season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to break down our must start defenses and go over what defenses you guys can pick up off of the waiver wire to help you guys dominate week 17 of the 2024 fantasy football season. Before we do so, let me remind you guys that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 17 NFL Pick'ems are already going live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up using promo code THECATCH, that link is down below, a free NFL Pick'em to use towards Week 17's action. And on top of that, when you sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH, Underdog is also going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free NFL pick'em to use towards Week 17's action and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up using promo code THECATCH. All right, let's kick the video off with the Miami Dolphins, who will be traveling to face the Cleveland Browns. Coming off of a pretty lackluster day against the San Francisco 49ers, just 5 fantasy points, 1 interception, 3 sacks, and in total allowed 17 fantasy points. And this has not been a defense that I have trusted throughout this season, basically whatsoever. I mean, they're the defense 29 in fantasy football, but boy, oh boy, do they have quite a good matchup this week against the Cleveland Browns and Dorian Thompson-Robinson at the quarterback position. Obviously, Jameis Winston was benched this past week, so we moved on to DTR at quarterback for the Browns. He wasn't much better. 2 interceptions, a fumble, 49 yards on the ground, and 20 of 34 passing for 157 passing yards. So the turnover upside is going to be very high for the Dolphins going into this game. And this is all we're looking at is what's the turnover upside? Are we playing against one of these backup quarterbacks? And the teams that are doing so, like the Bengals this past week, the Falcons this past week, these are the teams that we want to look out for that high upside here in the final week of the fantasy season. So the Dolphins, haven't loved them on the season, have not trusted them. They sit at just 33% roster. They weren't great this past week, but if they're out there and available, they have to be one of the top ads off of the waiver wires when it comes to streaming defenses here in Week 17, because this matchup against the Browns is way too good to ignore. So let's take a look at the Indianapolis Colts, who will be traveling to face the New York Giants. The Colts coming off of a pretty lackluster week as well, just 6 fantasy points, allowed 30 total points, had 1 sack. They did have 3 interceptions, but they gave up too many points in the end for a good fantasy outing. We talked about them this past week, and I liked them a lot more when Will Levis was going to be the assumed starter for the Titans. And it turned into Mason Rudolph, and like I said, the Colts still kind of showed up, and I mean, they have 7 interceptions in their last 3 games. They've been getting after the football for the most part. They're just giving up a lot of total points, and ultimately that's hurting them from a fantasy perspective. But nonetheless, they're playing the New York Giants this week, the team that just gave up over 20 fantasy points to the Atlanta Falcons. Drew Lock really struggled this past week, had a lost fumble, 2 interceptions, threw a touchdown, and had 210 passing yards, but ultimately a lot of turnovers. And the Giants have become one of the very best teams for us to stream defenses against. So I absolutely love the Colts going into this week, currently sitting at just 37% rostered. Tons of turnover upside this week. And even if the Giants make a quarterback change, like whether we see Drew Lock, Tommy DeVito, or Tim Boyle at quarterback, I'm not worried about it. This is still one of the best offenses to stream defenses against. So the Colts were a little bit disappointing this past week, but it kind of came off them as the week went on, and we learned that Will Levis wasn't going to be the starter. And like I said, 6 interceptions on their past 2 games against Bo Nix and Mason Rudolph is not the worst, right? And they're definitely going to have potential for multiple interceptions going up against this Giants offense at home here in Week 17. So the Colts, kind of lowly rostered at 37% rostered, I think are a top streaming option for defenses here in Week 17. Next up, I want to talk about the Las Vegas Raiders, a defense that I absolutely have not trusted on the season, coming in as a defense 31 overall, 7 fantasy points in Week 16, allowed 14 points, not too bad against the Jags. 1 sack, 2 forced fumbles, 2 fumble recoveries. So once again, we're not necessarily looking at this defense based on what they've done over the past couple weeks or on the season, although it's worth noting they've basically played their best defense fantasy-wise over the past 3 games with 7 or more fantasy points in 3 straight games, which isn't saying a whole lot. But what we're looking at ultimately at a team that's just 9% rostered is the fact that they're playing the New Orleans Saints, who are coming in to this Week 17 matchup with a backup quarterback starting and very little offensive firepower. So Jake Hayner or Spencer Rattler, whoever it ends up being, dependent on what happens in Monday Night Football against the Packers, Spencer Rattler is starting. Either way, it's going to be a good setup to stream against when it comes to this New Orleans Saints team. So maybe Rattler's a little bit better than what we've seen out of Jake Hayner. Like I said, Monday Night Football will give us a better picture, but I'm going to go ahead and guess that the Packers defense is going to have a good game on Monday Night Football and that the Raiders are going to have an opportunity to do something similar in Week 17 against this very same Saints unit, right? I mean, we got Alvin Kamara hurt, Taysom Hill hurt. Your only wide receiver on this team is MBS, essentially. So everything's here outside of the quarterback position for the Raiders to show up as well. Now, I mean, there's not a lot of firepower on this Raiders defense as well. They hold a lot of risk. But if you're out there looking for some upside, I do think that the Raiders could be a high upside streaming option going into Week 17. Except I want to take a look at the Los Angeles Rams, who are sitting at 11% rostered, coming off a game where they had 9 fantasy points against the Jets. They had 1 sack, a forced fumble, and a fumble recovery against Aaron Rodgers and company. 12 points the week before against the San Francisco 49ers. So they've been a bit of a wishy-washy defense, but they only sit at 11% rostered, and I think that they have a pretty unique opportunity this week against Kyler Murray and the Cardinals. Kyler Murray has had an interception or more in every game since Week 12, and this past week, 1 interception and a lost fumble. Outside of that, he was pretty good, and this offense definitely fought back and put up some points against the Panthers in that loss. But ultimately, there's going to be some turnover potential for the Rams at home this week against the Cardinals, and James Conner is dealing with a knee injury that he suffered towards the end of that matchup against the Panthers, and if James Conner misses this game, there's a big element taken away from that Cardinals offense, which could certainly help the Rams defense. So the Rams, maybe not my favorite streaming option this week, but they're very lowly rostered. And if we get word that Connor's not going to play, there's some turnover potential here with the way that Kyler's been playing as of late. And I think this offense really misses its biggest key component, arguably, if James Conner does not play this week. They do have some other running backs on this team that can do some things, but they're not at that level that James Conner is at, right? So if you're desperate for a streaming option, I think this is one of the better streaming options as the week progresses, potentially if you're left with nothing better here in Week 17. All right, next up, I want to talk about the Atlanta Falcons, who will be traveling to face the Commanders. And I went kind of back and forth on this one because I think there's opportunity for both the Falcons defense and the Commanders defense, but I'm going to take a stronger look at the Falcons, who come in at 58% rostered because they have scored 13 or more fantasy points in 3 of their last 4 matchups. Now, I mean, they faced some very questionable quarterbacks over the last 2 weeks, but outside of the Minnesota matchup in Week 14, this defense has looked really good overall. I think there's a lot of risk involved here, though, because they're on the road going up against Washington. Jaden Daniels just did a ton of damage to the Eagles, threw 5 touchdowns, but he did throw 2 interceptions as well. And even with all the offensive damage that Jaden Daniels and company did against the Eagles defense, fantasy-wise, still came away with 10 total fantasy points. So I think that the opportunity is still here for the Falcons. I think you could potentially still roll with them this week as a good floor option. I don't know if the upside is nearly as high as it's been over the last 2 weeks against Desmond Ridder and Drew Lock and these backup quarterbacks and bad stagnant offenses. It's going to be a much tougher matchup on the road here against Washington. But I think that they do still hold a pretty good floor. And like I said, I think the Commanders are interesting. They haven't been playing great as of late. 8 fantasy points against the Eagles this past week was actually their best mark since week 7 of the season. But I think they are a potential interesting start if you're desperate against Michael Penix, who didn't really do a whole lot this past week. Bijan Robinson and the Falcons defense essentially did everything in that matchup against the Giants. And it is worth noting, I mean, Penix was 18 of 27 for 202 passing yards and an interception. So I think there's a strong chance that either defense here can walk away with a solid fantasy outing, and both could have solid floors. But if I'm going to pick one to have a bit more upside based on the past couple weeks, I'm going to say it's the Falcons defense here in week 17. And speaking of the Eagles, last but not least here, let's take a look at the Eagles versus the Cowboys at home in week 17, coming off of a performance, like we just said, where they had 10 fantasy points, 1 sack, 3 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, and 2 interceptions. Even though they gave up 368 total yards and 36 total points, still had double digits and 10 total fantasy points. So the Eagles have been great in terms of a real life defense for the most part over the past couple of weeks, but they haven't necessarily been great in terms of a fantasy perspective. But they came through this past week, got you double digits on the road against Washington, and Dallas has not been that bad. Cooper Rush has not been that bad. I'm recording this before Sunday Night Football finishes like usual, and so far Cooper Rush is playing pretty dang okay against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, right, who have a really bad secondary, so that doesn't surprise me, but there's still some sort of turnover potential with Cooper Rush as a starting quarterback, as in his last 3 games outside of Sunday Night Football, he's had 2 fumbles and an interception. So we'll see how things finish against the Buccaneers, and I actually think Cooper Rush can have a pretty good game against the Buccaneers. We've been saying that throughout the course of this previous week. But nonetheless, the Eagles should be in place for another solid floor, and they're at home. They have a lot more on the line in this week 17 matchup. So if you own them, obviously they're 77% rostered. I would just keep rolling with them. I think they give you a safe floor here in week 17. And that'll do it for today's video. There are your must-start defenses and streams heading into Week 17 and the final week of the 2024 fantasy football season. As always, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So if you guys need anything whatsoever moving into Week 17, please drop me a comment. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I possibly can. And as always, most importantly, make sure that you guys are subscribed to the channel, because we're going to have everything you guys possibly need this week to help you guys bring home a championship here in the 2024 fantasy football season. So be sure that you are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.